Well, Mike, we're live.
We are live.
I know I say that all the time, but I wonder if people believe us now. And I wonder if they could tell immediately the difference between this and a recorded show.
Not a chance.
No. And Zuck does occasionally warn me, be very clear if you're claiming to be live and it's a recording. So I think this constitutes pretty fair.
It's on record now.
Yeah, I think so. Oh, man. I had another beef with Zuck this week, but it had to do with reporting nudity on Facebook. So I can't actually share what's out there. Maybe I'll tell that story after we start the show. What do you say?
Why don't you start the show, Lou?
Okay, we're going to do it. Welcome to hotlou Happy Hour. I am your host, Louis Bramowski, or somewhat scantily cladly known as hotlou.
I will never go to a Minneapolis park, Mike Franklin.
Sorry to hear that.
Is that what you're referring to?
I was not. I was referring to the nudity of this photo that in one of the amazing groups that I get in arguments with on Facebook about masks and not wearing masks and things, which we'll get into it here in a moment. Some guy had his cover photo, this photo of Donald Trump naked in maybe the most positive way possible. How do I say this discreetly? I think saying he was just incredibly well endowed is a fair way to say it.
Okay, all right.
And this had been his cover photo for a year. And not out of spite or anything, but out of curiosity, because as you know, and as the loyal lunatics know, I've been now in Facebook jail a couple of times over entirely benign images in the last year and a half or so. So I just don't understand how a photo like that can sit there for a year. So I reported it, and it immediately came back as, no, this is fine.
Wait, this is a friend of yours or just someone you spar with?
It was somebody in one of the groups, and I wasn't even talking with them, but I happened to notice their cover photo was just this photoshopped image of Donald Trump as a cover photo. I report it because it's so clearly against Facebook's community standards. There's in my opinion, no gray area whatsoever. And yet I've been in Facebook jail over literally one of them was just a photo of people on a beach, which made no sense. And so I was curious because I hadn't really reported an image in a long time about the process. So I report it, and 5 minutes later it comes back and says, this image does not go against Facebook's community standards. We understand it might be offensive to you. Would you like to block this person? And there was an appeal option. I had to click into it a couple times. So I went in and appealed. It came back 12 hours later as, no, it's totally fine.
I don't know. It's all a black box to me, Lou.
Yeah. So if people want to share nudity, maybe the cover photo is the fair spot to have that happen. I'm not sure. But I can't help but notice, as I remarked prior to the show, that you being more of a Trekkie than a Star Wars fan, you are not on the Starship Enterprise.
No, not. And I think we're about to get into it here because it occurred to me that the subject of our show today might be a little bit of a disagreement that you and I had, or at least the inklings of a disagreement on an article that I shared with you in our vast show prep coming up for today. And as I was selecting my virtual background, it occurred to me that you being the star of this show, I figured I had to be on the bridge of a Star Destroyer.
It's funny that you mentioned that because the other day I asked who the favorite cast member of the show was, and I gave Hot Mike number 3. I think I actually said Mike Loaf, hotlou, or the Bat. And I'm sad to report that somehow, some way, Mike Loaf got 0 votes, and the Bat and I split the votes because, frankly, of the cast members that I prefer in order, I think, are Mike Loaf, the Bat, and then myself.
While I'm sad that I failed this popularity contest, Lou, I'm not surprised.
Yeah, well, I was, because every time I'm on the show by myself and I'm desperately clinging to some new Snapchat filter and or massage option, it occurs to me that I want the show to be more of a Darth Loaf show. Well, with that, should we share the article? I can share the screen. You being on the Starship Destroyer there.
Star Destroyer.
Star Destroy. Thank you. Starship Enterprise. We got the streams crossed there. So the title of the article was "Why Sweden Succeeded in Flattening the Curve and New York Failed." Maybe I can share and not share this as it goes on, but I want to lay a little bit of groundwork here, because this has been now, I think, if we back up probably about 4 months ago, we knew that this would be an interesting experiment, because Sweden was, like, by all accounts, trying to avoid lockdowns. And I think it kind of went quiet for a little while. And then I think a handful of people were trying to push this narrative that Sweden was doing horribly. I was looking for some evidence of that. I didn't see any of it.
No, I think the evidence was they had a secondary spike in cases. And if you put the chart back up, it sort of shows that it's very faint, but there's the solid line is deaths, and then the dotted line are cases. And
I see.
Part of the interesting point of this article, and actually also was covered on yesterday's Ben Shapiro Happy Hour, was that interestingly now, and this article references it, Sweden's death rate is essentially zero. That there's been like one death over the past few days. And I don't know if that's appropriate. It probably has nothing to do with the conversation we're about to have, but it is interesting. And there's at least some supposition that they might have acquired something akin to herd immunity based on their experiment, but that it's too early to tell that. But it's also very interesting that their numbers are essentially zero. Now, I should also point out, New York's are also essentially zero, or very, 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 very low relative, certainly to where they were, obviously at the top of that peak there.
Yeah, and that's interesting to hear that that's what the kind of data was a couple of weeks ago about how Sweden was failing. Because I'll be honest, I looked at this on my mobile device and I can't see the faint lines on my mobile at all.
Yeah, I'm looking on my laptop here and I can barely see them. So you really have to let's see, image credit, Yinan Weiss. Yinan, buddy, love you, booby, but you have to do better. Gotta do better.
Yeah, is it too early to cancel Yinan?
I don't know. I'm actually working with you, and we'll talk about this, I think, on a subsequent show, on a definition that we can agree on as to what cancel culture is, or what being canceled entails. So maybe we'll apply that to Yinan at a later time.
Yeah, I'd like to put a little bit more branding and maybe a little bit more entertainment value on it, because I didn't understand it for my own lack of creativity and understanding the text that you sent. But yeah, I'd love to actually create the hotlou definition of cancel culture. And at this point, Yinan doesn't qualify, but we can certainly be creative on that. But to the point that we started this conversation, my immediate reaction to the headline, which reads, "Why Sweden Succeeded in Flattening the Curve and New York Failed." And I think that, certainly tells the story here, right? In the graph here, certainly in terms of deaths. My immediate reaction felt like, oh, this is going to be one of these we shouldn't lock down sort of articles. So I think I might have been looking at it through that particular lens. But the text message that I sent back to you, I basically shared 3 points on this. And we'll be sure to include this in the article in the show notes. But, as I was reading this, what I was really interested in was understanding the fundamental differences between Sweden and New York. And there are a couple that to me stood out that aren't mentioned in the article that we'll talk about in a second. But, what I think the core here was that the second paragraph here is the debate over Sweden's approach to the COVID-19 pandemic, which relied on individual responsibility instead of government coercion to maintain social distancing, is far from over, which I mean, I can't disagree with that, but I think that concept kind of is this common thread through the article, is that kind of a lot of the differences boil down to the individual responsibility. Did I get that right?
I think you got it right, but I think that where I sort of read your response back to me in a way that it was kind of an aha moment was I'm looking at this column, and it bears noting that the Foundation for Economic Education is a very sort of Austrian school economic, so sort of proto-libertarian group. And I read some of their stuff. This was posted on Facebook, so I read it with interest. One of the assumptions that I made as a sort of follower of that school is it's not to say that the debate is the two approaches are individual responsibility versus government coercion. The interesting, I think, assumption that the article makes, and it sort of explicitly mentions it here and there, but it could have made stronger for for the audience that wouldn't automatically recognize von Mises as I did, is that government, especially national government, is basically powerless to do much about this. And I come very much from that school, that there's really not much you can do short of advise that as you pointed out, most Americans didn't practice individual responsibility. Probably most Swedes didn't either, or many of the Swedes who got infected. There are some levers that government can use and has used that can be effective. I think the most important, which the Swedes did, and arguably we did, but I'd say that our approach was muddled at best, was public education. Sort of, look, we pay all these epidemiologists. Here's what they came up with. Now, where the paths parted was most American governors adopted, and this is really shocking to me as someone who's a student of what this country used to stand for. Most American governors took the approach of basically a centralized command and control element. They decided to put themselves in the position of standing for that. There's this threat. It's almost like, and the article sort of makes this comparison. It's almost like terrorism. There's a threat, and only government can protect you from the threat. I mean, that was the underlying approach that Cuomo took, that Walz took, probably most American governors took. I think you could just as easily have done this article, though, this fee article, on Florida, Georgia, Texas. We don't necessarily need to look at Sweden as the model. That any of the states, which is the relevant comparison, because Trump has very few tools relative to despite what you said earlier about the profile pic. Trump has very few tools in his toolkit relative to the state governors. I mean, the state governors were always and are still the front line in combating the public response to the COVID-19 outbreak. And so I think it is a fair comparison to compare Sweden or any other U.S. state to New York or Alabama, what you pick. I think that's a fair comparison. Sweden functions much more like a state government than what we would consider to be a national government. Going all the way back, the underlying assumption and conclusion that the article makes is that the reason that the shamers, the closers, what we used to have openers and closers, right? The pro-maskers, to apply this to a very live current debate, the underlying assumption that they seem to be making, and which is kind of heart-wrenching to me, is that government policy will have any meaningful impact on behavior one way or the other. And if you read it through that lens, I think you might come away from the article with a different approach, which is that Sweden's results were not all that different from the vast majority of European countries. They did worse than
excluding Italy and Spain, right?
Right. And so, in other words, there is a spectrum, right? And sort of this debate gets boiled down to Did we lock down hard enough, or did we not lock down hard enough? Did we require masks early enough, or did we not require masks early enough? The point the article makes is that's not really ever going to work. At least not in a free society, which most of Europe still largely is, at least culturally. The United States is probably at this point, very close to a European country when it comes to our expectations of individual responsibility and freedom. And so the sort of the layering on of the media here, which reports these things, the impetus for the article was a New York Times column that more or less put this in reverse and said that Sweden was I forget the term they used, but like a bellwether, a terrible example of what's wrong. And the argument that the author concludes is essentially one that boils down to narrative über alles. That the narrative here is that the only thing that can save us from COVID-19, ignoring what you saw in New York, which was the most locked down state in the country for a time, is government control, is lockdowns, is dictates, is perpetual public emergencies like we're debating here in Minnesota right now. And in order to get to that conclusion, you sort of have to ignore a bunch of evidence, like Sweden, like Georgia, like New York City versus upstate New York, for that matter. And there was a key sentence that I highlighted that it says, in a sense, the disagreement over the pandemic largely resembles a much larger friction in society. Key point. Should individuals be left free to pursue their own interests and weigh risks themselves, or should they be guided, coerced, and protected by planners who want to do all this for them? That's coded into my DNA, right? I look at everything. Yeah. So I read the article and went, wow, this is great. And you read it and you were analyzing a different sort of set of underlying facts, I think.
Yeah, I think that's what that's what our differences boil down to. So let me respond to just a couple things quick. I joked around maybe a couple of weeks ago. Actually, I think it was more than that, because there was like this dam failing in Michigan, and I had said something along the lines of like, I leaned in and I was like, closed circuit to the libertarians. When you've got global problems, the only thing that can solve them is governments, right? And that was, that's where I kind of look at this. But I think there's far more nuance to that, right? So when you've got a culture like Sweden, where I think there is, these Nordic countries seem to, and it might, I've never been to one, but as I understand it, there seems to be
effectively live in one,
yeah.
I'm not being flippant, like
yeah, totally.
Much of this DNA of Minnesota and other northern tier states, it comes from that.
Yeah, absolutely. But you get this sense that there is a little bit more individual responsibility, both from how it personally affects them as well as the community at large. And I would be shocked if there's this really large movement in Sweden that has some sort of anti-mask narrative, right? And I think that when you got organic's not fair to say, because I have no idea where it comes from in these Nordic countries, but it seems to be like they're the ones that are experimenting with universal basic income, right? With universal healthcare. They're taking on some extra responsibility to not only help themselves, but others as well. So when you can implement a system like that, it seems to be you're going to have far more compliance in a country like Sweden versus particularly a city like New York. And then, where they're kind of famously rude and famously selfish in their behavior, right? And they're not only that, they're proud of their selfishness, right? If there was a New Yorker on the show that right now, they'd be like, fuck yeah, I am, right? But so that to me kind of stood out, because we're still in this weird battle that some people think that despite the fact that, you can sneeze through a mask and it doesn't end up on a petri dish, still are in denial that a mask can work. But I'd be pretty shocked if that's happening in Sweden.
What I would say to that is I get that you see a lot of that on social media. In practical matters, in real life, I don't think that's a very big proportion of the country that doesn't see the wisdom of mask use, especially if you're exposing yourself to situations which might otherwise cause the virus to transmit. But more to the point, I kind of reject that Sweden is a more, well, okay, I'll accept that Sweden's probably a more docile, compliant populace than the United States. I think that's fine. How many times have they been to the moon? I do think that it is healthy. There's a healthy way to be skeptical about what the government is telling you. That health, it's a two-way relationship. That sort of with rights come responsibilities, right? And sort of like I think there is a time in our lifetime where that was much more understood, well understood. Because we didn't start from the premise that the government is there to do everything for you. I do think Sweden is probably further down that path than we are, but I think we're further down it than maybe, the watch is talking at me, than many of you
from the deck.
I think we are. So when you see people revolting against being forced to wear a mask, and I think that's the factor, it's that the idea here is that the government has spectacularly failed on many fronts. And the article talks about, probably the biggest failure that U.S. governments have made, New York being probably the worst example, was failing to protect our elderly in nursing homes. And there was a quote in there that sort of the authors contend sort of lays this bare, the quote, when referring to, I believe this is one referring to people objecting to shutdowns. Cuomo, who's hailed as this governor that got it right, when he's sort of like, if the numbers dictate he's spectacularly failed his own people. Quote, they don't have the right to object. That is the rule and that is the regulation, and they have to comply with it. And I can't remember if that was on the lockdown or in the third bullet in there, it was the policy of forcing nursing homes to take COVID carrying patients. Which was adopted by numerous U.S. states. It was started with New York, but started with numerous U.S. states. Probably did more to make our numbers look the way they did and make that spike. There we go. That's what I thought. This is relative to the early decision by many governors, Cuomo being, I think, the first or at least the most prominent, forcing COVID carrying patients back into nursing homes, which probably even then was sort of predictably the worst thing you could do. In Minnesota, the vast majority, it's well over 80% of the deaths that our state has experienced have been of nursing home residents. And so, that was one card the government could have played because they had a lot of interrelationship there between homes and the government failed largely. It sort of does go back to, at least to me, as the point of, and there's a quote in here from a Harvard business school. Here's the good news. You can shut down businesses or keep them open, close schools or stay in session, wear masks or not. Or he's a graduate of the Harvard Business School. Quote, the virus will make its way through in either case. If we protect the elderly, then deaths will be spared. And I'll make the point, maybe as we continue on about this, that I'll just call back to my early and then sort of perpetual perspective on this, that if the stated public goal had been and remained bending the curve, flattening the curve, I think that there would be a lot more license given to the government, because that is something that sort of we all could buy into. Sweden opted for one approach to bend the curve. They basically said, look, this thing's real bad. I think they actually did impose some, it wasn't the Wild West. I do think they had some capacity limits on restaurants and bars and things like that. They never shut down schools. I think that's pretty well documented. But by and large, they trusted their citizens to do the right thing. I don't know, but I bet that the experience in the United States was not all that different. That the best and the most effective tool our governments had in their toolkit was education, was basically telling the public, here's how the virus is transmitted. Here's what we recommend you do to combat it. And then leave it.
And I think that was maybe the biggest point, but there were two other pieces of context that I think the article just completely ignored. That bothered me about it. So like, it's pretty difficult to argue with the premise here that Sweden succeeded in flattening the curve, whereas New York did not. But by ignoring the fact that Sweden didn't have a president literally saying the virus was just going to go away and they had it fully under control, but instead we're out there educating people on exactly what they need to do to protect themselves. That I think was a very important point that was absent from the article.
In the art of debate, we call that a red herring, which is
Okay.
which is to say that, you know, if like I mentioned earlier, if you look at probably just about any other U.S. state and overlaid their experience with this, and so, you know, why are we picking on New York? It's because I haven't done this research, but probably most states in the United States would look like Sweden. So
Right.
I don't think the president's bloviating had made a difference one way or the other, especially in light of the fact that it's the governors who really had the control and the authority, the power to do, you know, various different things. So sorry about that.
We might also see that yet, and we might just not have seen it yet in, you know, California, Texas, Arizona, and Florida. We'll see, but that, you know, that's fair. I just thought it was bizarre that was kind of absent from the article, but I get that it feels like a red herring. So the other huge components here that, sure, we're picking on New York, but they, you know, to use New York in this particular case, and ignore the fact that it's this hub that, you know, literally allows travel to every major city in the world, is also ignored in this fact. Along with, like you said, it's so weird to me that, well, it's not weird to me. I get why people think Cuomo is amazing, right? He spoke really well and pandered to the people very well, despite the fact that he lost control of things. But there were two massive things that he screwed up. And I think, like, if I look at this timeline, I want to say it wasn't till like right here, like the end of March, or maybe it was like April 10th, if I remember right, that he closed the subways.
I think it was even later than that, and this gets to a point that I would make here, that Atlanta is a major international hub, LA is a major international hub, Seattle is a major international hub, Toronto is a major international hub. None of those cities had numbers like this. You know, Louisiana and specifically New Orleans had something, I think, kind of similar to this, and Detroit, which is not a major international hub, had numbers that were closer to this than to Sweden. So I sort of disagree with that premise too. There's lots of very cosmopolitan cities. Paris is a very cosmopolitan city. Didn't have numbers that probably look a little more like Sweden than like New York. So I don't think that that's particularly relevant. But what New York does have in common with Northern Italy, with New Orleans, is a whole bunch of people on top of each other. You know, at all times. You know, very densely.
Yeah. So that was the other point that I was going to make on that. Right? Is that.
You know, it might even have been later than April 10th, and that is not even on the governor as much as it's on the city. That, in other words, you know, the government is not a amorphous blob. There are different, at least in the United States, there's separation of powers, and the more local you get, the more responsible they should be. And we in Minneapolis have had some experience with that. And I think that, you know, I know I've seen charts that if you pull out New York City, you know, their statistics from New York State looks a lot like the rest of the country.
I guess the point I'm trying to make here is that we were relying on personal responsibility, and there was some education happening in New York City, and there weren't lockdowns in the appropriate spaces, and yet this happened, and there were multiple layers and context that made that happen, right? So, like, I think part of the two arguments that the author was trying to make here, in terms of, you know, just trusting the public to use personal responsibility and that lockdowns weren't really working, I think in a way they accidentally made the opposite case, given that New York didn't do lockdowns in a couple of the places where they should have, and were relying on that personal responsibility, but didn't see that. But then yet when they enforced a ton of that stuff, that's actually when it started seriously moving down. So I think they accidentally made a little bit of a case for the opposite thing.
Yeah, you and I don't see that the same way. I mean, I think that's sort of correlation causation sort of fallacy.
That'd be fair. Yeah.
And I think that it's hard to argue. I have to go back and look, but I think it's hard to argue that New York, and specifically New York City, wasn't one of the most locked down localities in the United States. You know, barring you know, what do we used to call them, essential industries and things like that. But I think that I think the larger point that I took away at least, and I think that the article was trying to make was like that the guy from Harvard I just quoted was, at the end of the day, none of it probably mattered all that much. Humans are going to human, and where we trusted individual responsibility. I mean, if you compared Stockholm to Minneapolis, my guess is, Minneapolis is pretty well locked down. Stockholm, far less so. If you compared Minneapolis to Orlando, at the height of this, my guess is the numbers all look pretty similar. That where we could make differences, it was probably on the margins. And where we were locked down, like they weren't all that well enforced. People were still out there. People were the famous, right? We were still all going to Walmart without masks on for a long time.
And protesting,
right? Later on. And so I think the point is, if you don't live in if you're not willing to enforce the lockdown, okay, like maybe that would have made a huge difference if we had, police roving up and down the street and a national curfew, absent 2 hours a day where you could go get some, distance-free social distancing sunlight or something. Then there really wasn't a lockdown per se. What we did was we just caused a bunch of economic harm that was avoidable, which I think is a larger point.
And I think more importantly, especially for the lunatics, it created a massive amount of damage to my waistline. And
put on the COVID-19.
What's crazy is I didn't actually add any weight, but my waist is 2 inches larger, which basically says I wasn't exercising and I was eating a lot of Oreos. So with that, I enjoyed this Crossfire Hour. We'll have to see if the lunatics enjoyed it too.
I enjoyed it too. And I do think that, this is obviously going to be one of the most studied phenomenons, not just the Sweden, New York thing, but this whole, what is the appropriate role of government? What should we do the next time this happens? This is going to be studied. This is the biggest deal that's happened to humanity in 75 or 80 years. And so,
and like I said, we really lucked out that the, mortality rate is probably somewhere between like 0.5% and 1% across the general population. Right. If it had been 20, like things would have been really bad. But we got this awesome dress rehearsal that a bunch of the Asian countries got 20 years ago with SARS and other things. And now I think as this stuff happens, people are going to take it more seriously. And even if we don't have that huge compliance with personal responsibility that maybe we saw in Sweden, we're going to see it next time, even if there are those rogue people out there anti-masking, because that is the very vocal minority. I think we're in agreement there. But if we have a large enough percentage who take this seriously for the first time, after hearing the boy who cried wolf, that SARS was going to destroy our country and Ebola was going to destroy our country, and then it never happened, then we didn't believe it, but now we do. And this is a great dress rehearsal to potentially prevent the next massive disaster. So, okay. I think this is a good point to end. What do you say?
I agree.
Yeah. We could use a little outro music one of these days. Maybe Chief Fact Checker Josh Kimbrough will be our producer one day.
I would like at least a bit of acknowledgement to my name here on the screen.
I said it briefly, but I don't think you heard me.
Oh, did you?
I did, yeah. So for those who missed it, Darth Loaf might be the new rebrand for Hot Mic number 3. I'm in favor of it. Let's see about you, lunatics. All right, thanks everybody for tuning in to today's hotlou Crossfire. Appreciate you. I'm your host, hotlou.
I am Deputy the Emperor, Mike Franklin.
And we'll talk to you tomorrow.